So how many of you know who this gentleman is? You may not recognize him, but you will be familiar with the name. It's Thomas Borgen, the former CEO of Danske Bank, who resigned in September following the 200 billion euro money laundering scandal which engulfed that bank and which has been the subject of a lot of newspaper and media coverage over the last year or so. And this gentleman, it's maybe less likely that you know his name. He is in fact Howard Wilkinson, who was recently identified as the whistleblower from the Danske Bank Estonia branch, who basically blew the whistle on what was happening there. I'll come back to him later on. So what we're going to do is a bit of a deep dive into the Danske case, because I'm not sure that the lessons coming out of this so far are necessarily the ones, or are not necessarily all the ones which need to be learned, but you can be the judge of that as I go on. But I should say the information on which we're basing the following is drawn from the report which was commissioned by Danske Bank itself from the Danish law firm Brun and Hjejle. Forgive my pronunciation if that's wrong. And we'll give you a link for that if anyone's interested. It's a public document and is well worth a read. So the background to all this is that earlier on in the century, Danske had acquired the Estonian business of the Finnish bank, Banco Sampo, and it was integrated in stages within the Danske Bank group such that by 2007 it was effectively the Danske Bank branch in Tallinn, Estonia. And within the Estonia branch was something called the non-resident portfolio, which was a portfolio of several thousand clients from outside the country, from outside Estonia, from places such as Russia, the former Soviet republics, Turkey, the UK, and so on. And it's fair to say that the Estonian regulator, the Estonian FSA, wasn't happy with how this was being managed. So you can see from this slide how an inspection report from August 2007 complained that whilst the approved internal rules were mostly in compliance with the requirements set forth in the legislation, nevertheless the actual activity of the department was not in compliance with international practice. And indeed, on the back of that inspection, over the following few months, nearly 600 accounts from the non-resident portfolio were closed. But the Estonian FSA weren't the only people who were unhappy, apparently, with what was happening in Danske's Estonian branch, because a couple of months earlier, in June 2007, the Russian central bank, no less, had complained to the Danish regulator, the Danish FSA, that the facilities and services of Danske's Estonian branch were being used for tax evasion, capital flight, and money laundering. So they weren't happy either. So the Danish FSA asks the Danske Bank Group in Copenhagen to comment on all of this, which they do on 27th August 2007, in what we might now think, in light of subsequent events, is a slightly strange way, because they state that the conclusion of the Estonian FSA inspection, that's the one I referred you to just now, from 20th August 2007, was that the bank complies with existing laws and regulations. But, I mean, that's not true, is it? The report said that the policies complied with the legal requirements, but that the actual practice was different and, in fact, non-compliant. So, not the same thing. And they again went on to state that the Estonian FSA report contained, quotes, no material observations, close quotes. Again, not true. And that the Danske Bank AML model had been implemented. And it's here that we get to what is, in retrospect, something that I think is very hard to understand and more to justify, in that over the following 6 years, there is an absolute divergence between the audit and compliance assessments of the Estonia branch conducted by Danske Bank themselves on the one hand, and the almost persistent alarm bells which are being rung by the Estonian FSA on the other. So over the course of 2008 and 2009, for example, there are a series of internal audit and AML reports which give satisfactory ratings to the branch, which referred to considerable improvement in the application of KYC principles, and which produce, despite a few shortcomings, predominantly green reports on AML issues. Yet 2 years later, so now we're in October 2009, the Estonian FSA again reports that despite an apparent improvement in attitude amongst the staff, not quite sure what that means, documents and information about customers and their activities did not comply with either legal requirements or internal policies, and emphasizing again the importance of obtaining information on things like beneficial ownership and control and underlying economic activities of customers. Yet at executive board meetings of Danske in 2010, everything is reported as fine. So one example of the optimism that seems to have prevailed is that even though the annual AML report to the board stated that the Estonian branch accounted for a 30% market share of suspicious activity reports, that means that the branch in Estonia was accounting for 30% of all SARs filed by all banks in Estonia to the FIU. This was nevertheless seen as a good thing because it was evidence of a higher standard in Danske Bank compared to other banks in Estonia. And other potential concerns about Russian transactions were effectively dismissed on the basis that they were all taking place within a highly adapted and effective control environment, and the Russians knew about them anyway and weren't concerned. So no mention there of the Russian central bank letter that I showed you from 2007. And it goes on. A group internal audit report of 14th November 2011, despite referring to room for a further improvement in the AML process, gives a satisfactory rating and talks about shortcomings having been fixed. So this is not exactly language which is designed to send the bank to DEFCON 3 and start launching mass audits and all the kind of things that we've seen happening recently. And then again in February 2012, we're at now, more complaints from the Estonian FSA to the Danish FSA talking about serious AML CFT issues in the Estonian branch, about their perception that the concentration of risk in the branch from customers in high-risk countries was deliberate, and about the same risk patterns being present as were identified 3 years previously in 2009 and 5 years previously in 2007. But when, again, Danske Bank in Denmark is asked to comment on these findings by the Danish FSA, their response gives not even a hint of doubt. They say they operate a determined control environment, that the shortcomings referred to in the 2007 Estonian FSA report have been corrected, and that, I quote, "As a closing note, we would like to state that we feel confident that the control setup described above mitigates the actual risk regarding high-risk customers in Sampo Bank at a satisfactory level," close quotes. So, everything they know is wrong, but they double down, and we get an AML compliance visit lasting a day, it seems, on 7th May 2012, which rates all but 2 areas in the Estonian branch as green. That's the best rating out of 3. And this is despite the fact that they've identified that as of today, incoming payments are not screened. And a group audit report nearly 7 months later, at the end of November 2012, awards the Estonia branch an extensive rating for anti-money laundering. That's the highest rating that can be given, with no recommendations for improvement. No recommendations for improvement. At this stage, it almost feels, doesn't it, like we're on the Titanic heading into the night on the 14th of April, 1912. But we're not. We're heading into 2013, for which year it seems that Danske had no formal group head of anti-money laundering. And when, despite further rumblings to it from the Estonian FSA, the Danish FSA finds itself being asked to write a letter of support to US regulators in support of Danske's application to open a branch in New York. So this now is getting even more serious, because we all know what the attitude of US regulators and the US government is to money laundering breaches. So in April 2013, Group Compliance tells the branch that, look, we can't afford to have any problems or failures in this area, especially now there's an American angle to all of this. But as if to assuage any concerns they may have had, we have a group internal audit report from 1st August 2013, an audit which includes group auditors, i.e. auditors not from the Estonia branch, so presumably from group or from outside the country, which states that KYC procedures at the branch and related internal controls are reasonable, that the KYC documentation is generally sufficient. Yeah. And then the iceberg hits. Danske in Denmark gets an anonymous email from a whistleblower who turns out to be Howard Wilkinson, who we saw earlier, and it's headed up whistleblowing disclosure, knowingly dealing with criminals in Estonia branch. And he goes into detail in relation to one particular customer. No financial data, fake company accounts, knowingly dealing with a criminal, collaboration in the filing of fake information in an account connected to Putin and the Russian Internal Security Service, and the widespread use of UK limited public partnerships to hide ultimate beneficial ownership. And there are several emails that follow over the next few months about other customers saying similar things. So a real audit, mob-handed, you might say, is undertaken, and the worst is confirmed. We cannot identify the actual source of funds or beneficial owners, and an employee within the branch confirmed verbally in the presence of all three auditors that the reason is that it could cause problems if the Russian authorities request information, and that the branches have entered into highly profitable agreements with a range of Russian intermediaries where the underlying clients are unknown. So in a sense, that's the end of the story, so far at least. Here you can see the spread of the money flow between 2007 and 2015, which, if you add up all the bars, comes to approximately 200 billion. And then you get outside experts commissioned to do a review who find that the branch has pretty much been breaching every kind of AML and CFT standard that we have a rule for, including, and bearing in mind that this was as late as 2012, 2013, not screening customers against PEP lists and not screening incoming payments against sanctions and terror lists. So the question, as ever, is, how can this happen? Why don't we see it coming? And it's here that a very important principle of psychology becomes relevant, for which, as a compliance officer, if you're not aware of it, you need to be, and that is confirmation bias. The human tendency to search for and interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So, for a very simple example, you might feel that every time you think about your mother, she calls you on the telephone. Okay? Now, almost certainly, that's not true. Your belief that it is true, however, means that you register and take note of every time you're thinking about your mother and she calls you. And you, of course, don't notice or register those probably many occasions when either you were thinking about her and she didn't call you, or you weren't thinking about her and she did call you. That's confirmation bias. And it's been proven in many psychology experiments down the years, from Peter Wason in 1960 onwards. So, look, I can't be sure. I don't know. I wasn't there. But let's say you go on a compliance review and you believe that there's no problem because that's what everyone's telling you. So the question you ask is everything okay? And when you look at the stars, they beam back at you the comforting answer, yes, everything's okay. When in fact, when you strip away your confirmation bias, the answer may well be no. So, rules for compliance officers. I think an investment of resources, time, money, people in a really, really effective assurance process will, in terms of disaster avoidance at least, give you a return which is many times greater than an equivalent investment in making sure that you have absolutely 100% perfect policies and procedures, which you take out and polish regularly so that you can show them to the regulators when they come and visit you. As the slide says, it's no good having perfectly adapted policies which aren't being followed in practice. Your assurance must be A1 at all times so that you can detect the differences between what should be happening and what actually is happening on the ground in the operations. Because, as the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman once said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself. And, unfortunately, you are the easiest person to fool.